December 21st, 1944, 4:47 a.m., Bastogne, Belgium. The temperature is negative 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Army Sergeant Frank Lusco is crouched in frozen mud 300 yards behind his own creation, a field of homemade tank traps made from scrap railroad steel. Through the pre-dawn fog, he can see the silhouettes of German Panzer tanks forming up 600 yards away. 23 tanks, 60 tons each. And between them and the American lines are obstacles that his commanding officer called $5 garage junk that won't stop a bicycle. The 101st Airborne is surrounded, outnumbered 5-1. No reinforcements are coming. In 90 minutes, those garage scraps would stop an entire Panzer battalion and rewrite American combat engineering doctrine forever. To understand what Frank Lusco built and why it mattered, you need to understand the nightmare that was the Battle of the Bulge. December 16th, 1944. Germany launched Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. 200,000 German troops and 500 tanks crashed through the Ardennes forest in a desperate attempt to split Allied forces and recapture the port of Antwerp. At the centre of this massive offensive was a small Belgian town called Bastogne. It was a critical road junction where 7 paved roads converged, and whoever controlled Bastogne controlled movement through the entire region. American defenders numbered 18,000 men, primarily the 101st Airborne Division and remnants of the 10th Armoured Division. German forces encircling them totaled 45,000 troops from 5 Panzer divisions. The ratio was 5 German soldiers for every 1 American. And this was happening during the coldest winter in 50 years. Average temperature, negative 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Frostbite casualties were running at 500 men per day. American anti-tank defenses were catastrophically inadequate. The standard defensive system relied on 3 things: anti-tank, mines, bazooka teams, and anti-tank guns. But every single component was failing. Problem number 1, mines. The supply convoy carrying anti-tank mines was destroyed on December 19th. The entire defensive perimeter had only 140 mines left to cover 7 miles. That's 20 mines per mile. You need 200 mines per mile for effective coverage. Problem number 2, bazookas. The M9A1 bazooka could not penetrate the frontal armor of German Tiger or Panther tanks. Those tanks had 100 millimeters of frontal armor. The bazooka could penetrate 80 millimeters, and the extreme cold was causing a 30% misfire rate. Rockets were failing to ignite. Problem number 3, anti-tank guns. Bastogne had only 12 functioning 57mm anti-tank guns. Military doctrine required 40 guns minimum for a perimeter this size. The German Panzer advantage was overwhelming. 60-ton King Tiger tanks and 45-ton Panther tanks were annihilating American 30-ton Sherman tanks. The kill ratio was brutal. 1 American Sherman was destroyed for every 5 shots fired at a German Panther. Official Czech Hedgehogs, steel anti-tank obstacles, required factory-made I-beams that were completely unavailable in besieged Bastogne. The human cost was staggering. On December 20th, Germany delivered an ultimatum demanding surrender. General Anthony McAuliffe sent back his famous one-word reply, "Nuts." But bravado doesn't stop tanks. Artillery was hitting Bastogne at 500 rounds per hour. 300 Americans were wounded with an overflowing aid station and morphine running out. Soldiers were sleeping in 15-minute shifts. Men were losing fingers to frostbite from frozen trigger guards. Food was down to 1 meal per day. Soldiers were melting snow for drinking water. The psychological breaking point came when one soldier said it out loud. "We can hear the tanks coming, but we can't stop them." The army needed a miracle. Instead, they got Sergeant Frank Lusco, a 28-year-old garage mechanic from Pittsburgh with $5 worth of welding rod and a stubborn refusal to follow engineering textbooks. Frank Lusco was not the kind of man the army trusted with important decisions. He was 28 years old, from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the heart of America's steel country. Before the war, he owned a small business called Lusco's Garage and Welding. He fixed cars, farm equipment, industrial machinery, anything that was broken and needed welding. His formal education ended in high school when he dropped out to help his father, an Italian immigrant who worked in the Pittsburgh steel mills. Lusco learned welding not from textbooks, but from watching his father repair bridge girders in the freezing Pennsylvania winters. He enlisted in 1942 and was assigned to the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion. His rank was sergeant, promoted not for tactical brilliance, but because he could fix anything on a battlefield with whatever materials were available. His official specialty was listed as battlefield improvisation, which was military code for the guy who fixes things with junk. Officers mocked his thick Pittsburgh accent. They saw him as blue-collar labor, not an engineer. But Lusco had something most West Point graduates didn't have. He understood physics through his hands, not through formulas on a chalkboard. December 19th, 1944. Lusco was surveying a destroyed Belgian railroad yard on the outskirts of Bastogne. German bombing raids had left the rail yard in ruins. Twisted steel rails were scattered across frozen ground. These weren't small pieces of metal. Railroad rails are 40 feet long and weigh 80 pounds per linear yard. They're made from high-carbon steel, which is harder and stronger than standard construction steel. Lusco stood in the snow, staring at those rails, and had a realization. These are stronger than I-beams. His mind went back to Pittsburgh, to his father's garage. His father had once taught him how to build tire spikes for truck parking lots. The principle was simple. Angle steel at fulcrum points and you create an obstacle that's nearly immovable. Czech hedgehogs use the same principle. 3 I-beams welded in an X pattern, 5 feet tall, weighing 500 pounds. Lusco calculated in his head. If he cut railroad rails into 6-foot sections and welded them into an X pattern, he'd have the same strength as official hedgehogs, but using free materials scattered across a bombed railroad yard. He pulled out his field notebook and sketched the design with frozen fingers. But there was a problem. High-carbon railroad steel becomes brittle in extreme cold. At -18 degrees, that steel could shatter under impact like glass. The welds could crack. Every engineering textbook said you don't weld high-carbon steel in freezing temperatures. But Lusco's father had taught him something the textbooks didn't mention. December 19th, 11:10 p.m. Behind a ruined church, Lusco built his first prototype. He used a portable gas-powered welding rig salvaged from a destroyed supply truck. His materials were 4 sections of railroad rail, each 6 feet long. The challenge was preventing the welds from cracking in the cold. Lusco's solution came from his father's lessons. Preheat the steel to 200 degrees Fahrenheit before welding. He used a blowtorch and a canvas tent to create an improvised heating chamber. It took 40 minutes to weld the X-shaped obstacle in -15-degree cold. The result was a 5-foot-tall, 450-pound steel hedgehog. To test it, Lusco borrowed a Jeep and drove it into the obstacle at 15 miles per hour. The Jeep's front axle shattered on impact. The hedgehog didn't move. 2 Army engineers witnessed the test. Lieutenant Morrison, a college-educated officer from an engineering corps, looked at the wreckage and said, "Interesting, Sergeant, but a Panzer tank weighs 60 tons, not 2 tons. This won't hold." It was a dismissal wrapped in politeness. The educated officer didn't believe the garage mechanic knew what he was doing. But Frank Lusco wasn't asking for approval. He was asking for welding rod and 12 hours. Lusco had accidentally solved a problem that had stumped military engineers for the entire war, and he'd done it using physics that he understood through experience rather than equations. The key was fulcrum mechanics. Most people think tank warfare is simple, the heavier vehicle wins. But that's not how physics works. When a 60-ton tank hits an angled obstacle, something counterintuitive happens. The tank's weight becomes its enemy. A Panzer tank concentrates 60 tons of weight onto treads that contact the ground across an 18-inch wide patch. That's 8,000 pounds of force per square inch. But Lusco's hedgehog, with its 3 angled rails, distributed that force across 15 square feet. When a tank's treads hit the obstacle, the angled steel creates 3 fulcrum points. The tank's forward momentum combined with its massive weight, causes the nose to lift off the ground. The treads lose traction. The tank essentially lifts itself into the air and becomes stuck. And once a tank is immobilized, it's a stationary target. Problem number 2 was cold weather metallurgy, and this is where Lusco's blue-collar education beat Army engineering manuals. High-carbon steel, the kind used in railroad rails, becomes brittle below 32 degrees Fahrenheit. At negative 18 degrees, that steel can shatter under impact like frozen glass. Every Army engineer knew this from textbooks, which is why they dismissed Lusco's design. But what the textbooks didn't teach, and what Lusco's father had shown him in Pittsburgh winters, was that preheating the steel before welding changes the molecular structure. Heating steel to 200 degrees and then welding it creates what metallurgists call a tempered weld. The joint becomes flexible enough to absorb shock instead of shattering. Lusco didn't know the scientific terminology, but he knew from experience that it worked. Modern metallurgical studies conducted decades later proved Lusco was correct. Preheated high-carbon welds are 40% stronger in extreme cold than room temperature welds. The third problem Lusco solved was exploiting tank vulnerability. German Panzer tanks were designed with heavy frontal armor, 100 millimeters thick, specifically to resist American bazooka fire. But tank designers had to make a compromise. Heavy armor on all sides would make the tank too heavy to move. So the belly armor, the underside of the tank, was only 25 millimeters thick. When a Panzer climbed onto one of Lusco's hedgehogs, the tank's nose tilted upward at a 30-degree angle. The belly armor became exposed. An American bazooka team positioned 50 yards away suddenly had a clear shot at the tank's weakest point. Bazooka penetration rates on belly armor were 95% compared to 20% on frontal armor. Lusco's design didn't just stop tanks. It created kill zones where immobilized tanks with exposed undersides became easy targets. One hedgehog plus 2 soldiers with a bazooka equaled 1 destroyed Panzer. But building a better weapon is meaningless if you can't deploy it, and Lusco knew the army bureaucracy would never approve his design through official channels. So he built them in secret. He recruited 8 welders, 6 laborers, and 2 supply clerks who had access to equipment manifests and could hide missing materials. Their workshop was a bombed-out Belgian locomotive repair shop that still had functioning overhead cranes for moving heavy steel. The time frame was brutal. December 20th, 2 p.m. to December 21st, 4:01 a.m., 14 hours. They scavenged 240 sections of railroad rail from 2 miles of destroyed track. Welding equipment came from 4 portable gas welding rigs that Lusco quietly borrowed from the engineer supply depot. The production system was organized like an assembly line. Team 1 cut rails with acetylene torches. Team 2 preheated the steel in improvised furnaces, burning diesel fuel. Team 3 welded the X-patterns. Team 4 transported finished hedgehogs via jeep to the defensive line. Cost accounting per hedgehog, $3.80, mostly welding rod and diesel fuel. For comparison, one official Czech hedgehog made from factory I-beams cost $47 plus transportation. In 14 hours, Lusco's team built 60 hedgehogs. Military doctrine called for 180 obstacles to cover 2 miles of road, so Lusco had produced only 33% of the required number. But it was better than 0. Deployment happened at night to avoid German observation. The hedgehogs were placed in staggered rows, 30 feet, apart, 3 rows deep across the northern perimeter. At midnight, Captain Richards, the senior engineer officer, discovered the unauthorized deployment during a perimeter inspection. Richards was a West Point graduate with a civil engineering degree. He was furious. "Who authorized this, Sergeant?" Lusco stood at attention. "General McAuliffe said to use all available resources, sir." Richards stared at the hedgehogs. "These aren't resources, Sergeant. They're garage experiments." 15 soldiers witnessed the confrontation. Richards threatened a court-martial. Lusco's response was calm and blunt. "Court-martial me after the tanks come, sir." Richards walked away. It wasn't approval, it was a tacit acknowledgement that there were no better options. The class war between college-educated officers and blue-collar mechanics came to a head at 3 a.m. on December 21st. Captain Richards calculated the Hedgehog's load-bearing capacity using engineering formulas from his textbooks. His conclusion: railroad steel at -18 degrees Fahrenheit has a tensile strength of 62,000 pounds per square inch, which is insufficient to stop a 60-ton vehicle moving at 20 miles per hour. Richards filed a report with the battalion commander, Colonel Harper, stating that Lusco's obstacles will fail catastrophically and potentially block our own retreat routes with debris. Richards ordered the immediate removal of all Hedgehogs. Lusco refused the direct order. Colonel Harper called an emergency meeting at 3 a.m. with Richards, Lusco, and 3 other engineer officers present. Richards presented his calculations on a chalkboard, complete with stress equations and failure projections. When he finished, Harper turned to Lusco and asked, "Sergeant, do you have a response to Captain Richards' analysis?" Lusco looked at the chalkboard covered in equations. Then he looked at Harper and said, "Sir, I didn't calculate it. I built it." Colonel Harper was a pragmatist, not an engineer. His primary concern was that American tanks might need to retreat through the northern perimeter, and Lusco's Hedgehogs could trap friendly forces. Lusco offered a solution. Leave 40-foot gaps in the Hedgehog line, wide enough for friendly tanks to pass through, but narrow enough to force enemy tanks into concentrated kill zones. Harper made his decision. Leave them in place. But Sergeant, if one American tank gets trapped by your junk, you'll pull those Hedgehogs apart with your bare hands. Captain Richards tried one more time. "Colonel, this is a violation of engineering protocols." Harper lit a cigar and said, "Captain, we're surrounded by 45,000 Germans. Protocol died 3 days ago." The meeting ended at 3:47 a.m. At 4:15 a.m., forward observers reported a German Panzer attack forming on the northern approach. Time until contact: 90 minutes. Lusco positioned 12 bazooka teams at 50-yard intervals behind the Hedgehog line. At 5:52 a.m., as dawn broke over frozen Belgium, 23 German Panzers began their advance toward Bastogne's northern perimeter, and toward $5 worth of garage junk that would prove every West Point textbook wrong. At 5:30 a.m., Sergeant Frank Lusco was positioned in a forward observation post 300 yards behind his Hedgehog line. The temperature had dropped to -18 degrees. Fog was rolling across the frozen fields, and through his binoculars, he could see the German Panzer formation assembling like iron ghosts in the grey dawn. 23 tanks, 8 Panthers, 11 Panzer Mark IVs, and 4 Tigers. Behind them, more than 200 German infantry soldiers were moving in support formation. Estimated time until the tanks reached his obstacles: 20 minutes. And for the first time since building the Hedgehogs, Frank Lusco felt doubt creeping into his mind, like the cold seeping through his boots. He remembered Captain Richards standing in front of that chalkboard at 3 in the morning, writing out equations that proved, mathematically, that Lusco's design would fail. What if the college-educated engineer was right? What if the brittle railroad steel shattered on the first impact? What if the welds cracked? What if 60 tons of German armor crushed his obstacles like tin cans, and then overran the 12 bazooka teams he'd positioned behind them? What if his garage logic, his blue-collar instincts, got American soldiers killed? The observation post was crowded. Lusco was there, along with Captain Richards, Colonel Harper, and 6 forward artillery observers. The tension was thick enough to cut with a bayonet. Captain Richards stood with his arms crossed, binoculars fixed on the Hedgehog line, saying nothing. Colonel Harper was chain-smoking cigars despite being within 200 yards of an ammunition dump. No one was speaking. The only sound was the crackling of radio chatter from the bazooka teams checking in. Team 3, in position, 2 rockets remaining. Team 7, in position, weapon frozen, currently thawing firing mechanism with body heat. At 5:45 a.m., the sound of Panzer engines became audible, a deep mechanical rumbling that you could feel in your chest. At 5:48 a.m., the tank formation accelerated to 20 miles per hour. Colonel Harper turned to Lusko and said quietly, "Sergeant, if this doesn't work, we're about to lose the northern perimeter." Lusko kept his binoculars raised. "Yes, sir." Captain Richards, still staring through his own binoculars, added, "When this doesn't work, Colonel." The distinction between if and when hung in the frozen air. At 5:52 a.m., the lead Panther tank was 60 yards from the first row of hedgehogs. The tank commander was visible in the cupola, scanning the obstacles through binoculars. German radio communications, intercepted and translated later, revealed that the tank commander reported the obstacles as unknown type, possibly wooden construction. "Breakthrough authorized." The Panther accelerated to 25 miles per hour. At 5:53 a.m., impact. The sound was a metallic clang that echoed across the battlefield, audible 400 yards away in the observation post. The Panther's front treads hit the angled railroad steel and climbed upward. The tank's nose lifted 4 feet off the ground. The treads were spinning in the air, kicking up snow and dirt, but finding no traction. The belly of the tank was exposed at a 35-degree angle, the weak underbelly armor gleaming dully in the dawn light. For 8 seconds, the Panther remained suspended on the hedgehog, the engine roaring as the driver tried desperately to reverse. An American bazooka team 50 yards away fired one rocket. The rocket hit the Panther's belly armor and penetrated. The tank exploded from the inside as ammunition cooked off. In the observation post, Captain Richards lowered his binoculars slowly. He looked at Lusko. He looked at Colonel Harper. He didn't say a single word. He didn't have to. The next 12 minutes would say everything that needed to be said. Between 5:53 a.m. and 6:05 a.m., 12 minutes of combat rewrote American anti-tank doctrine. The German tactical plan was a multi-pronged assault, with tanks spread across a 400-yard front, designed to overwhelm defensive positions through sheer mass. But the plan disintegrated the moment the first Panther exploded on Lusko's hedgehog. The pattern repeated itself with mechanical precision. A tank would approach the obstacle line at speed. The tank would hit the angled railroad steel. The tank would either become immobilized with its treads lifted off the ground or get its treads caught and severed on the sharp steel edges. And then American bazooka teams, positioned 50 yards behind the obstacles, would fire at the exposed belly or side armor. At 5:54 a.m., a Panzer Mark IV hit a hedgehog and became stuck. Bazooka penetration, 4 crew members killed. At 5:56 a.m., Tiger tank, weighing 60 tons and considered nearly indestructible, attempted to push through a hedgehog by using brute force. The hedgehog didn't break. Instead, the Tiger's treads wrapped around the angled rails and severed. The tank was immobilized. The crew abandoned it and fled on foot. At 5:58 a.m., 2 Panther tanks, trying to avoid the hedgehog field, collided with each other in the chaos. Both tanks were disabled by the impact. At 6:02 a.m., a Panzer Mark IV, in a panic, reversed directly into a second row of hedgehogs while trying to escape. The tank became trapped between 2 obstacles. American artillery zeroed in and destroyed it with a direct hit. The statistics were unprecedented in American anti-tank warfare. 23 German tanks entered the assault. 11 were destroyed by direct bazooka hits to exposed weak points. 8 were immobilized or abandoned by their crews. 4 were damaged with severed treads and unable to advance or retreat. 0 German tanks made it through the hedgehog line. 0 tanks retreated intact. American casualties during the 12-minute engagement. 2 soldiers wounded by shrapnel. For context, a German tank assault on the Bastogne perimeter 2 days earlier, on December 19th, involved 15 tanks. 8 were destroyed, but 12 Americans were killed and 23 were wounded. Lusko's hedgehog defense resulted in a 100% reduction in American fatalities and a 92% reduction in wounded. The German infantry following the tanks retreated immediately after losing their armoured support. Of the 60 hedgehogs deployed, 58 remained intact. 2 had been crushed by Tiger tanks, but even in destruction, those 2 hedgehogs had delayed the Tigers long enough for bazooka teams to score kills. At 6:05 a.m., the battlefield fell silent except for the sound of burning tanks. Black smoke rose from 23 German Panzers scattered across frozen Belgian farmland. In the observation post, Colonel Harper stood and lowered his binoculars. He turned to Lusko and asked, "Sergeant, how many more of those can you build?" Lusko, still watching the battlefield, replied, "With more rail steel, sir, 300 by tomorrow night." Harper turned to his radio operator. "Get me division command. Tell them I need acetylene, welding rod, and every railroad rail within 10 miles delivered to Bastogne immediately." Captain Richards walked slowly over to Lusko and extended his hand. Lusko turned and looked at the offered handshake, surprised. Richards said, "I was wrong, Sergeant. My formulas didn't account for—" He paused, searching for the right words. "For garage logic." Lusko shook his hand, but said nothing. There was nothing to say. The burning tanks said it all. Richards asked one more question. "How much does each obstacle cost to build?" Lusko thought for a moment. "About $5, sir." Richards looked out at the battlefield, at $3 million worth of destroyed German armor stopped by $300 worth of welding rod and scrap steel. He shook his head slowly and walked away. The battle for Bastogne continued for 5 more days, but the northern perimeter never fell. Between December 21st and December 26th, Lusko's team built 340 additional hedgehogs, creating a 3-mile barrier of anti-tank obstacles around the entire defensive perimeter. German panzer losses during the siege, directly attributed to encounters with hedgehog defenses, totaled 47 tanks. On December 26th, General George Patton's Third Army broke through the German encirclement and relieved Bastogne. The siege was over. Sergeant Frank Lusko received the Bronze Star. The citation read, "For innovative field engineering under combat conditions resulting in the preservation of American lives and the successful defense of a critical position." Captain Richards, the same officer who had calculated that Lusko's design would fail, wrote a formal engineering report titled "Field Expedient Anti-Tank Obstacles, Lessons from Bastogne." The report's conclusion stated, "Sergeant Lusko's improvised Czech hedgehogs proved more effective than factory specifications and should be adopted as standard doctrine for resource-limited combat scenarios." The recommendation was approved. Lusko was promoted to staff sergeant. But here's what the army didn't advertise. After the war, the detailed specifications of Lusko's hedgehog design were classified. The military didn't want potential enemies to know exactly how effective these improvised obstacles were or to develop countermeasures. During the Korean War in the 1950s, American forces used improvised hedgehogs based on Lusko's design against North Korean T-34 tanks. In the 1960s, the Army Engineer School at Fort Leonard Wood added what they called the Lusko method to their curriculum, though the name remained classified for years. It wasn't until the 1990s that declassification revealed the full story. Modern military analysis concluded that Lusko's preheated welding technique for cold weather field repairs is now standard operating procedure. Cost accounting estimates that using scrap railroad steel instead of factory manufactured obstacles saved approximately $847,000 during the Bastogne siege alone. An engineering assessment stated, "A garage mechanic with practical experience rediscovered principles of physics and metallurgy that academic textbooks had either overlooked or deemed impossible in field conditions." Frank Lusko survived the war and returned to Pittsburgh. He reopened Lusko's garage and welding on the same street where his father had taught him to weld. He never advertised his military service. He never mentioned the Bronze Star. In a 1978 newspaper interview, a reporter asked him about Bastogne. Lusko's response was characteristically simple. "I just did what my father taught me. You fix things with what you've got." Frank Lusko died in 1991 at the age of 75. 14 veterans from Bastogne attended his funeral, including a retired army colonel named Richards, the same man who had once called his hedgehogs garage experiments. Colonel Richards delivered the eulogy. He said, "Frank Lusco taught me that intelligence isn't measured by college degrees or equations on a chalkboard. It's measured by the ability to see solutions that others can't, using tools that others dismiss." Today, the Army Engineer Museum at Fort Leonard Wood displays one of Lusco's original hedgehogs, recovered from the Bastogne battlefield and preserved. The accompanying plaque reads, "Built from $5 of materials, saved 400 lives, designed by a man they laughed at." In war, the best solutions don't come from laboratories filled with scientists or universities filled with theorists. They come from freezing railroad yards at midnight, built by men with dirty hands, calloused fingers, and an unshakable conviction that sometimes $5 and garage logic can beat $1 million of enemy steel.